Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Verse by Verse. Grab your Bibles and follow along as we continue in our verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book study through the entire Bible. We are in Acts chapter 22. Now, I had attempted to do chapters 22 and 23, but there was just too much good stuff in there, so I only got a little into chapter 22. So I probably just go back and start read through, obviously, read through from verse 1, and because there's a kind of an important thing that I probably shouldn't have. I should have just again did chapter 22 and then chapter 23. But anyway, there's some good stuff here that I wanted to kind of go over again. So I'm going to start in verse 1 again. Now, Paul is brought before, remember he is mobbed, and then he is brought before the Sanhedrin, okay, by the Roman soldiers. The kind of Roman soldiers had sort of taken charge of the situation because it turned violent. Had the Jews been more cognitive, they wouldn't have. The last thing they want is to have Rome in their affairs. This is why you have the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin wasn't, which is kind of funny because, on the one hand you have the Jews, and you see this discourse even through with Jesus. We're children of Abraham, we're sons of Abraham, and we'll not be free. Well, really, from Israel's perspective here, ever since the Babylonian Empire, invasion, which was some 500 years previous, they have not been free. They have not been a free nation. They had really passed from one world dominating kingdom to the other. So they went from Babylon to the Medes Persian, from the Medes and Persians to the Grecian kingdom, from the Grecian kingdom to the Roman Empire, as from this narrative presently. So, under the Rome now, it's kind of like some of you are, if you're ever working at a job. It could be a hospital, it could be factories, something like that, and they change management, right? So the building is the same, but they change management. And what happens is that, when the new management come in, you got to get used to what? New rules, new procedures, right? And you can't say, well, our last management did that, right? So we're going to operate the way we want. No, new management, new rules. Well, Rome, new kingdom. And the one thing about Rome is that they had, when they would conquer someone, they did allow them to, have certain liberties, again, under Rome. That's how that worked, under Rome. And one of the things they did was, there were a couple of ways they would do things. They conquered, they put a garrison, which is a military base, a soldiers in. So there was a military presence throughout the kingdom. Another thing is that they would put what's called a colony. So a colony would have a military presence, and it was also culture. In other words, a colony was it was like a little Rome. Now, in some of your bigger cities, if you ever go to, like, for example, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, I know the major cities have them. Los Angeles, right? they have these little section that, for example, they would call them Chinatown, right? So Chinatown. And if you go to Chinatown, they're not colonies. The reason I'm using that is because if you, like, for example, if you go to any kind of Chinatown, they look like China. The architecture is similar. High concentration, obviously, of Chinese people, right? Language even. So sometimes you would see signs both in Chinese and in English. Well, that's what the Romans did with colonies. And then the next thing is that they did allow somewhat religious liberty, again, just as long as you paid your taxes and Rome was in charge. So in the case with Israel, they allowed them to have their religion, but for example, they could not fully obey Moses' law, right? There was Roman restrictions. For example, one of them was you can execute. But the other thing is that Rome would put in, Rome put in and installed, but the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling governmentship, they allowed this government, and their job was to keep order. From Rome perspective, they didn't care about the law. We saw that, remember, in Acts chapter 18, when they was going to argue, they were going to argue the law in Galileo, the proconsul, like, I don't care about all that stuff. Right? This is a waste of my time. Right? There was a nasty attitude towards it. But the Sanhedrin was to keep peace. Well, when Paul gets arrested, and the Jews, right? There's a riot. The Jews from Asia came, and they actually incited a riot. We know about riots. January 6th comes to mind. Okay. But I digress. So, in the haste to crush it, because the Roman leaders, the last thing they wanted was news that a riot was going to spread. Rome didn't like that. So, now you see the centurions now coming in and taking over somewhat, but you still have Paul meeting before. Now remember, and this is what I wanted to. Let me read this here. Where am I at? I wanted to read verse 11. This is where we left off last time. I want to go back, it says here, the following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Have courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." And so right here becomes what's clear, God's purpose. What is interesting, of course, is that Paul was warned in Acts 21 not to go to Jerusalem. So this is kind of, like, wow, right? So on the one hand, he was warned not to go to Jerusalem. He was even told by the prophet what would happen to him if he went. So how do we reckon this statement here with the warning? And we're not given a clear explanation. Let me just say that. We're not given a clear explanation. Did God decree for Paul to go through this? Because if he did, then why did he warn him? Okay? And so we're left with speculations, and I'm not going to dive too deep into that, because it's, again, where scripture is silent, we should be silent as well. So the only thing I'm going to say about that is that I think that God used Paul's weakness. Now, what is the weakness in this case? He didn't listen. Okay? He didn't listen. And I think sometimes that's for us. He didn't listen, and God used that. That's all. I think that's what it comes down to, that God used that. Okay. having said that then, since God did not, and this statement here kind of confirms that, and now we're going to see, we already have seen how God is using that. As I said, through his chains, through his imprisonment, his arrest, he is now in a position to speak to audiences he would never have had in the everyday normal of life like that. And of course, yes, God could have opened other ways and other pathways to that. And it's possible God would have. In other words, I think the fact that God had appointed Paul, that he wanted Paul to testify about the resurrection, okay, it's clear. How he was going to do that, well, maybe not as clear. And so, to me, he's using, in a sense, what is there. So again, verse 11 again, the following night, and I want you to notice this statement, the Lord stood by him. Now right there, I think this makes the difference in a lot of Christians' life. Whatever it is you're going through, this makes the difference in the life. Let me read something. This is going to be something that Paul writes, probably from this perspective, not too far, 5 or 6 years from his perspective here. But notice these statements here. The Lord stood by me. This is in 2 Timothy. Now, remember I said, we read in chapter 20 where Paul tells the Ephesus elders he did not think that they would ever see his face again. And they wept over that, right? And we said, as we know from history, so as we chart out Acts here, we come to the 28th chapter and Acts abruptly stops. But from history, they're able to chart Paul was released, but then was shortly rearrested. And at the time of 2 Timothy, he pretty certain his execution date is upon him. And this is why this is important, what he's getting ready to say here. That he's not, history kind of tells shortly after the writing of this letter, he was beheaded. But listen to what he says right here. Verse 16 said that my first defense, no one stood by me. But everyone, now the defense would be his hearing. So all of these kind of hearings, you can say defense, he's going through actually in Acts chapter, beginning here, he thought he had one, then he's going to have another one, right? He's going to have at least 3, I think, 1, 2, yeah, and then on his way to Rome. So about 3 to 4 defenses before audiences he would never have stood before. But notice what he says right here. At my first defense, no one stood by me, but everyone deserted me. May it not be counted against them. Remember we talked about, he mentioned Peter in the last chapter. Stephen, I'm sorry. And notice this thing, right? May it not be counted against him. That's what Stephen uttered when he was being stoned to death, as Paul was the one who was the official witness, who signed off on the execution. Paul signed off on it, like, go on, do it, okay? And now you see Paul uttering these kind of instances, the same prayer. May it not be counted against him. But look at verse 17. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the proclamation might be fully made through me, and all the Gentiles might hear. So I was rescued from the lion's mouth. Now, this arrest state here we see here in Acts, my point. And the reason why I say that is because when you look at the statement here, that night, the following night, the Lord stood by him. See, and as Paul said, not only did the Lord stand by him, but he strengthened him. He stood by him and strengthened him. And I want to say this. This is the one thing that every believer should rest in. See, the one thing every believer should, whatever it is you're going through, and the hardships of life, rely on God's strengthening you. That the Lord will strengthen you. Alright, so he says the night, I'll read again, the night following, the Lord stood by him and said, "Have courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify at Rome." Now again, whenever God tells you something, remember, it must mean that Paul was losing courage. And notice he said the Lord stood by him and strengthened him. Strengthened him, the Lord strengthened him. That's wonderful. It could be the Lord will stand by us and strengthen us in whatever hardships we go through. I am always saddened because Christians sink in their despair while the Lord is standing by ready to strengthening you. Okay. Alright, let's go on. He said, "For as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Okay, and that's exactly what happened. Paul's arrest puts him in these positions, notice, to testify. Alright, verse 12. "When it was day, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves under a curse, neither to eat or drink until they have killed Paul. And there was more than 40 who had formed the plot." Now I want you to understand this, because when I read this, I always chuckle over this. I want you to keep this in mind here. 40 plus men formed a conspiracy to say, "We're not going to eat or drink until we have killed Paul." That's the conspiracy. I want to hold them to that, right? Or at least I'm going to rub it in their face. Do you think they kept their own vows? Shows you how much hypocrites they are. But okay, let's go on. I just love this one here. But so verse 14, "These men went to the chief priests and the elders and said, 'We have bound ourselves under a solemn curse that we won't eat anything until we have killed Paul. So now, along with the Sanhedrin, make a request to the commander that you bring him down to you as if we were going to investigate him more thoroughly. However, before he gets near, we are ready to kill him.'" So think about this now, that they are plotting. So we want to bring Paul for a little further investigation. And here's the conspiracy, right? Bring him to us. We could go to him, but no, bring him here. Also kind of shows you sometimes the vulnerability of travel. Remember way back, even when Jesus was a baby and they traveled in caravans and stuff. One of the reasons why is because you were subject to carjacking, not carjacking, but you get muggings. But here they set this trap, this ambush. By the way, they were also going to have the Roman soldiers in on it. All right, but listen. But the son of Paul's sisters, hearing about their ambush. Now this is kind of one of the first things we kind of get a glimpse of Paul's family, right? His sister's son, his nephew. But the son of Paul's sisters, hearing about the ambush, came in and entered the barracks and reported it to Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander because he has something to report to him." So he took him and brought him to the commander and said, "The prisoner Paul called me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." Then the commander took him by the hand and led him aside and inquired privately, "What is it that you have to report to me?" "The Jews," he said, "have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the Sanhedrin tomorrow, as though they were going to hold somewhat more careful inquiry about him. But do not let them persuade you, because there are more than 40 of them arranging to ambush him Men who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they killed him. Now they're ready, waiting for a commitment from you. So the commander dismissed the young man and instructed him, don't tell anyone that you have told me about this. So there you see God, right? And there's God. Think about that. There is God. So it kind of go back to this one thing about when Paul said, when the Lord told Paul to have courage. I can imagine Paul sitting now in the jail thinking, did I mess up? Why didn't I listen, right? Now, what we're going to see, yes, maybe, you could say yes, maybe, but what is interesting, what's to me more important now is to focus on God and to see how God works. Paul's nephew, right? They didn't probably know that was Paul's nephew, and they just running their mouth, boop, 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 and there's Paul listening to them. I'm always amazed at how easy information can come. One person said that military secrets are the most fleeting. Okay? People run their mouth. And here it is. They made this conspiracy. Keep this in mind. I'm going to hold them to their conspiracy, though. I'm going to hold them to it. I'm going to see if they hold out. Right? They said they was not going to eat or drink until they killed Paul. Let's see if they keep their own oath. Verse 23. So he summoned 2 of his centurions and said, get 200 soldiers ready with 70 cavalry and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Also provide mounts so they can put Paul on them and bring him safely to Felix the governor. Now, not only does they miss their point, he doesn't go to Jerusalem. He's going to Felix. So they're going to take him to Felix the governor. We're going to get into that obviously in the next chapter. And notice, of course, now Paul gets this kind of military escort, armed escort. Like, okay, they're ready. Okay, so let's see, verse 25. He wrote a letter of this kind, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix. Greetings. When this man had been seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them, I arrived with my troops and rescued him because I learned that he is a Roman. Kind of not the whole truth, but look at this, right? By the way, we're going to see this over the next few chapters when Paul talked to these people, how information is they don't all tell all the truth. That's always interesting now. Always be leery when you listen to people's reporting of something. You kind of have to we don't always have access to knowing their motives, right? We don't always have access to knowing their motives. But no, this man right here, he forgot that I kind of arrested him being a Roman citizen on the word of these Jews, right? Doesn't say all that. He's kind of, alrighty. Verse 29, let's verse 27 again. When this man had been seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by him, I arrived with my troops and rescued him because I learned that he was a Roman citizen. You didn't learn that. You didn't rescue him because he was a Roman citizen. That's wrong. Even though he still would have been right, even if he said, I feared a riot. Okay, but he didn't. And by the way, it's kind of good that he's stating that Paul is a Roman citizen, but that's not why he rescued him. Remember, he was getting ready to scourge Paul. He's not kind of mentioning that in the letter. Paul had to tell him he was a Roman citizen to prevent from being flogged like the Romans normally do. And keep in mind, Roman floggings were not like the Jewish floggings. They were not limited to how many stripes they give you. They could lay as many as they want. And not only that, remember they were getting ready to flog Paul to find out why he was accused. And that's why Paul had to tell them, I'm a Roman citizen, to stop that torture. All right. Verse 28, wanting to know the charge that they were accusing him of, I brought him down before the Sanhedrin. I found out that the accusations were about disputes matter of their law, which means nothing to the Romans. He says, and that there was no charge that merited death or chains. Right? So why is Paul still in custody? He just said there's no reason for them to be even chained up. We're not bound by the law. Verse 30, when I was informed that there was a plot against the man, I sent him to you right away. I also ordered his accusers to state their case against them in your presence. To state their case against them in your presence. Verse 31, therefore the soldiers took Paul during the night and brought him to Antipus as they were ordered, to Antipatris. The next day they returned to the barracks, allowing the cavalry to go on. And when these men entered Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. And after he read it, he asked what province he was from. So when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing whenever your accusers get here too. And he ordered him to be kept under guards. He ordered that he be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Remember Herod? Now this is Herod. The name Herod was kind of not the name of a particular person, but the office itself, the monarchy. The last Herod we saw was killed back in Acts chapter 12. God had smote him and he was eaten inside by worms. Yes, gruesome. But as he comes to Cilicia, his hometown, remember this is a very important city, an influential city. This also carries weight. In other words, it determines how they were going to treat him, as opposed to him like from Jerusalem. They've noticed that the disdain they have for Jerusalem. But remember, Paul was born in Cilicia. This was kind of an upper middle class, an important city. Dignitaries and stuff lived there. This is an important city. It frames how they respond to Paul. So he's kept in prison. Now remember our friends with the 40, our 40 plus friends who bound by a curse. So he says, now I'll give a hearing when your accusers come. Now the commander had already testified. The commander had already testified to him that I don't see any charge worthy of even holding this man. So now it's a political game. Plain and simple. Also keep in mind that not only is it a political game, but it is also God's game, that they will hear, these men will hear the testimony of the gospel. And I'm going to throw this parting statement, because oftentimes people will ask about some tribe way up in the Amazon mountains who've never heard the gospel. And my response always is that you assume God has it arranged for them to hear. Like, think about this. These, so far, as we get into now the Roman dignitaries who will hear the gospel, because they're isolated, would not hear it under normal circumstances, but God is giving testimony to them, or will give testimony to them. In other words, don't assume that people don't hear. All right. All right, we'll pick it up in chapter 24 in our next study. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you then.